Hello and welcome to Atop the Fourth Wall, where bad comics burn. And trust me, while we're going to be talking about some good stuff over the next few weeks, we'll get a lot of crap too. 3 years ago, I went over the history of the Teen Titans, from their inception through my favorite incarnation of the book. It proved pretty damn popular, so I decided to finally follow it up last year with the retrospective, an overview of the forgotten Rom Space Knight comic that helped create a lot of new mythology in the Marvel Universe. Hell, we're even finally getting a new Rom book from IDW, so we'll see how that plays out. But for the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at someone I've technically already done a tribute for. The Blue Beetle. However, that episode was a long time ago and really was made as a response to the cancellation of Jaime Reyes' solo series back in 2009. I miss being that thin. It was also an episode that was only 15 minutes long and didn't really cover the full history of the character and his legacy. And since DC is trying this new Rebirth initiative that may very well be yet another reboot in a few months with another Blue Beetle book this fall, well, we should take a look at what's come before. Most newer fans are probably more familiar with Jaime Reyes these days because of his appearances in stuff like Young Justice, Batman Brave and the Bold, and hell, even Smallville. And by the way, you know it's a weird reality where the third guy to hold the Blue Beetle name appears before Superman does. The point being, we need to start at the very beginning with the very first Blue Beetle, Dan Garret. And there's a lot of history to go over before we even get into the actual damn comics, so let's dig into the early days of Dan Garret, the Blue Beetle, and all the things that came from him.
Welcome to Atop the Fourth Wall, where bad comics burn. Linkara's gonna teach you all a lesson you won't learn. Brodsky, you're not the smartest. Life out, you're not an artist. Anyone who's had a bad comic published, it could be your turn. Linkara, he's a man punch, wears a pretty hat. Linkara, he has a magic gun. Where'd he purchase that? Linkara, coins, robots, Amazon and trucks. Linkara, this comic sucks. Linkara.
The Blue Beetle.
Now, to explain Blue Beetle's beginnings, we need to talk about Victor S. Fox, who created the comic company Fox Feature Syndicate, aka Fox Comics or Fox Publications, in 1939. He was a bit of a huckster and saw the potential for comic books as big business. There are reports of him having worked at DC and saw the sales figures of the books, but there's no documented proof of that. And so started his self-titled syndicate to create books. At the time, while some companies had in-house artists and writers, there were also studios set up to create comics for larger companies on demand, one of which was the studio of Eisner and Iger. That would be comic legends Will Eisner and Jerry Iger, with the former in particular for pioneering the idea of a graphic novel, book-length comics with a continuous story, and trying to expand the medium outside of superhero work. The Eisner Awards, basically the comic equivalent of the Oscars, are named after him. But we're dealing with a younger Eisner right now, even before his work on The Spirit. When Eisner and Iger started out, they had a series of pseudonyms for themselves on the various books they had to create the impression that the studio had more people working at it than actually existed. Later, when they started developing a larger staff, they would keep the pseudonyms on hand to help prevent their staff from getting taken by other studios. But let's get back to Victor Fox's involvement with this. The first book that he wanted the studio to make for their company was Wonder Comics, starring Wonder Man, a super strong hero with a meek secret identity who could use his incredible strength to fight for truth, justice, and the American way. Victor, I can't help but notice that this character you want us to create is kind of similar to Superman. What? He's nothing like Superman. Nothing at all like him. Completely different. How so? Wonder Man wears red, not blue. And this may surprise you, but Detective Comics, renamed from National Publications, who published Superman, thought the two were kinda similar as well, and as such sued them over Wonder Man. And won. Although the funnier part of this story was that Fox himself had his headquarters in the same building as Detective Comics, and after the lawsuit, anytime the elevator stopped on their floor, he'd spit out the door at them. By all accounts, Fox was a bit of a character in his own right, stomping around the office with a cigar and loudly proclaiming, "I'm the king of comics! I'm the king of comics!" Which is especially hilarious because he did this once in front of Jack Kirby, who became a staff creator for Fox for a time. Yes, Jack the King Kirby. Which, if we go by this royalty theme, makes the joke I once made about Frank Miller being a court jester even more on target. But anywho, Victor Fox was not done trying to rip off other characters, which brings us to the Blue Beetle. The Green Hornet was enjoying quite a bit of popularity on the radio at the time, and the very first Blue Beetle comic wears that influence on its sleeve, with Dan Garret sporting what was essentially a business suit, mask, and a fedora just like the Green Hornet. Really, the thing that differentiated him the most was the blue scarab on his shirt, and probably because of that lawsuit, it was decided that maybe they should change up his look a bit. And while some different appearances were tried, it eventually settled on one that looked kinda like a ripoff of the Phantom, though that actually ended up helping it a bit when the book was reprinted in France. Recolored from blue to red and called The Steel Phantom, to make it look like the same character since the Phantom was more popular there. Ironic given the whole Superman and Wonder Man thing. So who was it who actually created the Blue Beetle? Well, it's widely accepted that it was a man named Charles Nicholas, but now we bring back that whole pseudonym thing. Now, there was a Charles Nicholas, formerly Charles Wachkowski, who is widely accepted as the creator, being at the very least the artist behind his looks and possibly the writer. Some accounts say Eisner also helped write the initial stories, but the thing is that Charles Nicholas was also a pseudonym used by Eisner and Iger. As a result, there are technically 3 Charles Nicholases. The aforementioned Charles Wachkowski, Jack Kirby, who used the name when he did the Blue Beetle newspaper strip, and finally Chuck Kuidera. Kuidera was also an artist at the studio and did some artwork for Blue Beetle's early issues, but the funny thing is that near the end of his life, he claimed that he was the Charles Nicholas who created Blue Beetle. And it's not like he was doing it to try to earn royalties or something. This was freelance work creating characters for other people who owned them outright, so it could have been memory playing tricks on him, or maybe it's the truth, or maybe he was just being a blowhard. Who knows? Back to Victor Fox, literally spitting at the competition wasn't enough for him. He was pissed and he set out to destroy Detective Comics for what had happened. Oh, Superman's getting his own self-titled comic? Screw you, we're launching Blue Beetle's self-titled comic. Oh, Superman's getting a radio show? Cram it, here's Blue Beetle's radio show. Part of the problem was Victor Fox's tendency, as you may have noticed, to rip stuff off. Aside from the occasional plot points and ideas lifted from other heroes and pulp stories and radio shows and the like, Fox had other business interests where he tried to compete in areas that, of course, never really took off. For instance, while Coca-Cola and Pepsi were competing in the early 40s and trying to stay afloat due to sugar rationing, Fox unveiled his latest creation, Cuba Cola, with vitamin B1. No reports of whether he spat the beverage at the Coca-Cola offices, but I'd like to think he did. He advertised it in the comics and on the Blue Beetle radio show, despite the fact that it did not actually exist. The idea was to create a demand for it, then sell the license to a soft drink company who would actually do the job of making the drink, presumably with far less vitamin B1. But imaginary soft drinks aside, there were other issues at the time aside from plagiarism or the like. Namely that Fox was forced into bankruptcy. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to his creditors. Hell, Eisner and Iger had stopped doing work for Fox simply because he owed them so much money. Now I know what a lot of you are thinking right now. Why the hell have I talked more about fictional sodas than I have the fictional character? Well, the thing is that the Golden Age Blue Beetle stuff is kind of insane. Other historical stuff that I've talked about before had pretty much a continuous story behind it. The early Teen Titans evolved in weird creative ways, leading to new versions of the team and a cast of hundreds, but ultimately a consistent story from how it started. ROM was basically an 80-part serial, with each story usually leading into the next. The early Blue Beetle, however, he was whatever the hell the creative team wanted to do at that point. Let's get started here with where he first appeared, in Mystery Men Comics #1. Now, judging by this cover, especially with the words Blue Beetle right next to him, that you might think that this is how the Blue Beetle first looked. Oh, no. That's another character, the Green Mask. What, can't you tell by the complete lack of green in his costume? And yeah, in the actual book his mask is green, but you could sooner call this guy the Orange Avenger. At least he's got orange on his belt. Anyway, we're immediately introduced to policeman Dan Garret as he's shot at by a random car. Fortunately, he spotted it in time to avoid serious injury, but the car also threw out a guy, specifically a banker who had previously been kidnapped. Dan Garret approaches the man. It was the Whiteface Gang. Damn mimes, they're getting more and more aggressive. They later ditched the car, so Dan was able to trace some information he found on it to a garage. A light flickers for several minutes and then dies out. A figure emerges and drives away in a high-powered car. Nothing can go wrong when I'm fighting crime in my Pinto. It seems it wasn't just the banker held hostage, but his daughter and secretary were taken. Not sure why they felt the need to shove him out of a car while firing on a police officer, but hey, I'm not a criminal who kidnaps bankers to get safe combinations. However, one of the criminals notices an object on a table. A Blue Beetle! I think it's a shiny! And thus enters our hero. Look, the Blue Beetle!
Ha 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 ha! Your costume is ridiculous!
As I pointed out before, here is the most un-Blue Beetle looking outfit of any of them. Admittedly, with a legacy character, I'm not against differences in costumes, but this one is just so different from the others since it's just regular clothes. Hell, the mask is white. The most blue part aside from the scarab on his chest is his suit coat, which, let's face it, given what happened on the cover, could actually be green. Oh, and the Whiteface Gang? It's more like White Kleenex Gang, since it's just a guy out of the three wearing a handkerchief over his mouth and nose. But hey, why would you want to hide the faces of the twin Grover Clevelands here? Anyway, the Blue Beetle says they don't need to torture anyone for the combination. He knows it and will give it to them for a 40% cut. They agree and tell him to come with them in case he tries to double-cross them. Left alone for a moment, the Blue Beetle takes out a small instrument which he invented. Ah, so the Blue Beetle is the inventor of the world's smallest violin. Actually, it is the Blue Beetle wireless phone, which he uses to call the police and warn them of the bank robbery. What? The Blue Beetle? At the National Bank at 12 tonight? But, hey, wait a minute! Oh, sorry about that, I accidentally started an app on this thing. God, I hate this interface. Of course, he had actually given them the wrong combination and manages to beat up one crook before fleeing, allowing the cops to clean up everything, including the reveal that the White Mask was actually the banker's secretary.
I would have got away with it too if it hadn't been for you snooping kids.
We also meet Dr. Franz, who runs a drugstore and is his assistant in his crime fighting. The story ends with Dan's partner, Mike Manigan, pointing out that they almost caught the Blue Beetle, so apparently the cops here aren't as fond of vigilantes. Or maybe they just want to give him a hat that actually matches the blue motif. Anyway, the story itself is fine. A quick 4-page introduction with a plot hole here or there that I didn't mention, but nothing too serious. The second issue of Mystery Men Comics reveals his next costume design as he chases after some crooks who stole from an armored car. And what I especially love about this costume is that for all the crap Superman gets for his glasses, here's a police officer, Dan Garret, without even the illusion of something covering his face. Oh no, this outfit has specifically cut a big face-shaped hole in it for the whole world to see. Still, it's closer to his most well-known outfit in that it is meant to be a big blue chainmail thing. The scarab has now evolved into a huge bug going horizontally across his chest, and for some reason he has antennae. I'm not sure their function. Perhaps to counterbalance his upper body as he bends over to moon his opponents. Also, pointy elf shoes. First I'll stop crime, then I'll go help Santa. In this story, the crooks capture him. A $20 bill gets thrown his way by accident and he gets his hands on it, then hops over to a window, since they left him alone in a room instead of shooting him in his very shootable face. He slips the bill under the slightly opened window. The Blue Beetle, paying people to come rescue him. A newsboy finds the money and, since newsboys clearly are in no need of additional cash, does the most sensible thing. Gives it to the cops. Because, you know, the cops are really gonna drop everything to work on some random $20 somebody finds. Or maybe they will, since they can't identify the Blue Beetle even when he isn't wearing a mask. Fortunately, the bill was marked, so they know it was part of the robbery, and thus they know where to find the crooks. Well, general vicinity of where, at least, but you get the idea. After the crooks are detained and the Beetle escapes, we learn what became of Tim the newspaper boy.
Gosh, he's wonderful! You should have seen what he did to that crook, and he gave me all this money!
With this stolen money, I'll finally be able to make that musical about newsboys that I know the world will embrace. Issue 3 of Mystery Men Comics. Oh dear Lord, Green Mask, that twist. That is Escher Girls material right there. I miss the days when we were equal opportunity in putting both men and women in contortionist posing. Anyway, in the 3rd issue, the costume has changed again, but it's definitely coming together now. In addition to actually having a mask, a tiny one admittedly, but it's still a mask, he's added a yellow belt. The antennae are still there, presumably because he gets really good reception on them. At issue 4, though, not only are the antennae gone, but so is the Beetle emblem on his chest. Instead, he's got a belt buckle with the Beetle on it, which I gotta say looks a lot better. He looks more like an armored insect, or at the very least, not as overly busy in his superhero attire. Also, the plot of this one clearly shows what happens after Tim the newspaper boy gains power. There's a protection insurance racket against newsboys. Issue 5 doesn't really change up the costume itself, but it does show that the belt buckle serves a practical purpose. It has a compartment full of master keys he can use to escape locked rooms.
Only one compartment on his belt? Noob.
Issue 6 brings another new addition to the outfit with yellow gloves. Here's the funny thing about all these costume changes. It actually really makes sense when we get to the DC version of the character and the modern-day retcon of the Blue Beetle's powers. We'll be getting to that in a few more episodes, but yeah, as silly as him failing to have a consistent look for more than 1 or 2 issues is, one could also argue that as a homemade crime fighter, his arsenal and outfit are evolving. Hell, if this was a movie origin story, I bet we'd have a montage of him altering the outfit over time until it got to its proper state. And yet, ironically, in issue 7, an entire gang of criminals dresses up like Blue Beetle to commit crimes, which should have been a dead giveaway. It wasn't really him. His costume is different already. Yes, in this case, a close-up of his face reveals a new scarab symbol on his forehead. Another thing to note is that back in the day, some superheroes had a method of announcing their presence. Because, let's face it, when you're dressed up in bright colors and masks, stealth is not necessarily your first priority. For example, Spider-Man had a flashlight on his belt, said belt usually being just behind his tights, to shine a bright red light on criminals. In old Batman serials, while the bat signal was used a few times to summon Batman by Commissioner Gordon, Batman also had a palm-sized version that he used to shine in the windows of criminals. Because being a superstitious and cowardly lot, I guess means them being spooked by a guy standing just outside a window shining a light in? In this case, Blue Beetle had a small beetle he would toss to criminals as a calling card before he kicked their asses. But starting here, he also has a flashlight with the beetle symbol. I like to think he's trying to merchandise. Buy the Beetle action figure and the Beetle flashlight to get a coupon for a free Cuba Cola. While the main story of issue 8 doesn't feature any new change to the outfit, the cover actually shows the beetle on his forehead being yellow now. Issue 10's cover changes up the forehead beetle again, this time with the beetle inside of a yellow circle instead of just alone there. Also, orange gloves. Also, Fu Manchu apparently. But hey, he does change it up in the story too. Although it's a bit surprising that he can, since he's busy making sure his belt doesn't crush his stomach. Good lord, man! That is not an acceptable weight loss technique! But this issue does reveal a new superpower for the Blue Beetle. He can talk underwater. I mean, look at this. It's clearly a speech balloon and not a thought bubble. Finally, he bobs to the surface for a much-needed breath of air. I've got to stop giving speeches to sea creatures. It's hell on the lungs. Blue Beetle would remain the cover hero for the remainder of Mystery Men comics, sometimes appearing with Gowron eyes as he's shot at racist caricatures, despite only ever fighting your standard issue goons in these books. Yeah, no supervillains in the early days, not that he really needed them, since it was a regular recurring element for someone to knock him out by hitting him in the back of the head. That's really crappy armor, Dan. I'm not even kidding, guys. I went to Twitter about this. Almost every issue either has him knocked unconscious from a blow to the head or using his head in a way that should have it concussed. It's amazing. Oh, and yet another design for the beetle on his forehead. No circle, but it's yellow now. It was also around this time that his solo series started up, advertised in the pages of Mystery Men, as he continues to fire his trademark gun. Yeah, it's kind of amazing that none of the cover artists knew what he actually did in the book. Oh wait, in this issue, he does finally use one. And only this one. It's especially funny because even reading these old books, you can tell the kind of fighting style he had. Dan Garret was a brawler, quick with his fists, dodging, but let his punching do the talking. Except when he was underwater. Yeah, that wasn't a one-time thing. In issue 13, his car gets trapped underwater, and he's still talking. Issue 14's cover debuted the look that he would later sport, though not in the book itself, namely the red gloves, but hey, at least at this point it was consistent, just little things here and there flip-flopping. And really, you shouldn't sweat the little inconsistencies. Taking a quick break over to Blue Beetle #1, it finally gives more of an origin story for the character. It begins with his father Michael, who was also a policeman. His mother died from a flu epidemic, and given the time period stated in the book, it was likely from the 1918 influenza pandemic. The angels grew lonely, Danny, and came for your mother to take her to heaven. Those bastard angels took her away from us, son! We must dedicate our lives to destroying all angels! And of course, being super duper awesome at all college activities, and probably hanging out with Ulysses Solomon Archer, who equally excelled but instead dreamt of becoming a trucker, Dan eventually was forced to come home when he learned his father had been shot in the line of duty. I'm going to join your mother, but those angels won't take me alive, Danny! Dad, I think that's the point. Curses! Those nefarious angels think of everything! Swearing vengeance on the crooks who killed his father, and joining forces with his father's former partner, the previously mentioned Mike Manigan. So wait, it was Mike and Mike who were partners on the force? A reporter apparently knows who's responsible, a gangster named Chick Alonzo. However, in a kind of interesting twist for comics of this era, instead of revealing that info, she's blackmailing Chick for money. However, she's keeping the names of the criminals in a safety deposit box, one that's apparently publicly known, since Dan, dressed up as the Blue Beetle already, sneaks in and gets the list. Going after Chuck, he interrupts the criminals as they're about to murder her over the blackmail. He manages to get Chick, delivering him to the police. Listen to this! This is my first blow against crime. I shall not rest until gangdom is wiped out. Then there's a bit right here that says, Opa Gangdom Style, and a few self-written in ha-ha-ha's. I think this guy's kinda nuts. Signed, the Blue Beetle. P.S. I'm not really sold on my superhero outfit yet. Do you think a black fedora would look cooler? While the book doesn't explain where he got the outfit from, back over in Mystery Man Comics, they gave a little more explanation to his abilities. Made almost invulnerable by special armor and given super energy by Vitamin 2X. Vitamin 2X! Now found in Diet Cuba. Yeah, almost invulnerable, except for his multiple head traumas. By issue 15, we started establishing more of a supporting cast outside of Mike Manigan and the occasionally appearing Dr. Franz, who made him his special vitamins. In this case, it's reporter Joan Mason, a love interest for Dan and the Blue Beetle. I'd say it was another transparent attempt at ripping off Batman and Superman, but reporter girlfriends were kind of a thing for superheroes anyway, so that's not necessarily the case. What's interesting about her is that apparently the city's criminals really have it in for reporters, since every story Joan writes that in some way talks about the criminal activities of the city means that she needs to be kidnapped and killed. Issue 16 brought us something that I, as a comedian, will cherish forever. We may not have supervillains, but we do have this notorious crime lord. Big dicks. I just don't get where Frederick Wortham got his theories about comics and sexuality from. He also sells faulty playground equipment that collapses under the weight of children, or possibly explodes based on this panel. That results in the death of children. Truly, he has lived up to his name of Big Dicks. Such activity demands action from the Blue Beetle. Big Dicks must be brought to justice! There are days when I really love my job. So you see, I must get big dicks. Yeah, I'm pretty sure at this point they knew what they were doing. Sometimes you watch my feet instead of my hands, big dicks. The only way this could have been any more perfect was if there was a newspaper article in the end talking about big dicks pulling a boner. Supervillains do eventually start appearing in the book, but really they feel inconsequential when we see their goons more than them. The first is a crook named the Sphinx, who dresses up in a big metal suit for no reason. He just does it near the end. How fitting that his first supervillain should be representing the worst evil known to the modern world. Ancient Egypt! Oh yeah, he also dies in the most agonizing manner possible, fire melting his metal suit around him. You know, for kids! Eventually, in issue 25, the Blue Beetle takes on the threat all superheroes eventually fight: the Nazis! Hell, in this one he even finally trades in his yellow gloves for red ones, making our final major costume change before it turns back into yellow in the next comic. His investigation into Nazi murders leads him to a morgue, which I suppose seems pretty obvious when we're dealing with murderers, but still. No sign of anything on him. Well, I'll be. Look at his feet. Quentin Tarantino got to him already. Warning, the Hoops Nazi gang steals cops' uniforms. Wreckers throw swastika rings around victims, which exp the Nazis when you need your villains to make really convoluted plans. What guts that FBI man had to write this clue on his feet with his own blood. In fact, I'm pretty sure he used some of his guts for this. Remarkable penmanship for writing in your own blood on your own feet. I wonder what EXP means. It means the Nazis are about to level up! Mystery Men Comics would end as it had lived, with the Blue Beetle getting a concussion and a healthy bit of racism along the way, with an adventure in Chinatown revolving around a statue of Kali. You know, the Hindu goddess. How does one respond to that sort of confusion of culture?
Prepare to meet Kali in hell.
But that still leaves 2 series left, the main Blue Beetle one, as well as a series called Big 3. Big 3 was probably another example of Victor Fox desperately trying to rip off DC. In this case, the World's Fair comics that had Batman, Superman, and Robin together on the covers of books. So here it was promoting 3 of Fox's heroes: Blue Beetle, Samson, and the Flame. The 3 don't actually cross over with one another, it's just another anthology like Mystery Men. Of those ones, the only thing of note is from issue 3, which features work from yet another legendary creator, Robert Kaniger, and apologies about the pronunciation, I couldn't find any specific guide to his name, who would go on to create Barry Allen, the Silver Age Flash. The editor at Fox Comics, a man named W.W. Scott, was the one to hire him when he was looking for new creators. He said to Kaniger in the interview, "Tell me a story." Kaniger responded, "A skeleton is driving an open convertible from Times Square. Not someone in a costume, but a real skeleton, and people are running in sheer panic." Kaniger was hired on the spot, and that story ended up in Big 3 number 3. So how did said skeleton drive a car? Look, Mike, a magneto coordinator.
And if your hands were metal, that would mean something.
When it equals the skeleton's wavelength on the black band, wham!
Of course! Don't you know anything about science?
The regular Blue Beetle comic wasn't really any different from any of the other series being printed, although interestingly enough, Dr. Franz's appearance changed over time, originally being a bald, middle-aged guy, and then changing into an older man with a beard. More laughable, though, is that the introduction of Vitamin 2X happened in the middle of the 5th issue, after several comics had already mentioned it. It gives a man superhuman powers. It allows a man to survive being hit on the head hundreds of times. I'll try it. Tastes sweet. Actually, Dan, that was one of my laxative pills. I noticed the good doctor doesn't actually say what sort of superpowers it'll give him. Anyway, the only other notable thing about the series was how Mike Mannigan became more and more of a comedic figure in the story, always huffing and puffing about catching the Blue Beetle. The good news is that unlike J. Jonah Jameson, he knew the Beetle was a hero, but he just believed in the law so much that he couldn't tolerate a vigilante. Still, he wasn't stupid about it most times. If there were criminals to catch, he'd prioritize the criminals first. After 11 issues, Blue Beetle ended, as well as Fox Comics. Fox disappeared for a few years, and rumor has it he enlisted in the army for World War II.
In reality, Dan Garret, a rookie patrolman, loved by everyone but suspected by none of being the Blue Beetle.